Tonight we're going to talk about Jeremiah, the 25th chapter. It's an interesting chapter because Jeremiah gives us a number of observations that he makes about how people receive or do not receive God's Word. The chapter really divides itself into a couple of sections. The first section we're going to talk about tonight. And next week we'll talk about the second section. The first section deals with the behavior of the people. And the second section deals with the restoration after the Babylonian exile, which Jeremiah is going to talk about. This is one of the places where Jeremiah gives us a date of the time of this great oracle, or the time of this great statement that he makes. He says it was in the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Well, when you go back into genealogies of the Babylonian Empire, we find out that this was the year 605 BC. Now, I want you to stop and think about something. Nebuchadnezzar became the king of Babylon. This was his first year, 605. What happened was he accomplished this by going in and conquering the city of Nineveh. In 611, the city of Nineveh was surrounded, and finally siege was laid to it, and the city of Nineveh fell in the year 611. Nebuchadnezzar and his father had something to do with this, and then Nebuchadnezzar, when his father died, Nebuchadnezzar went back to Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar became the king of Babylon. Well, people don't like to see their countries die, and so a group, or various groups, tried to reestablish the Assyrian Empire by setting up a capital in Haran. And then a great battle down below Syria, or in the southern part of Syria, a great battle took place in the year 605. And that was called the Battle of Carchemish. And in the Battle of Carchemish, the Egyptians and the Assyrians were gathered, and Nebuchadnezzar went in there, and he had a great victory at the Battle of Carchemish. And so this really was quite an accomplishment for this man Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Jeremiah begins talking to the people of Judah. Remember, the Assyrians had taken the northern kingdom into captivity. That happened in 722. Or about 117 years before Jeremiah made his debut here. But that was a terrible thing that these people had to put up with. And now this is just a little while before they're going to suffer the same thing. But as Jeremiah talked to them, he had a big problem. We'll get to that problem in just a few minutes. The Assyrian Empire was known for its ruthlessness. It was probably the most torturous, ruthless empire in the history of the ancient world. The Assyrians would take the people that they had conquered, and sometimes they would sharpen a large, kind of a log, and they would jam these people with that log and then stick them up on a stick and just let them hang there until they died. That was, we have some pictures, by the way, of this very thing, where they would carve out stones and show some of their battles and things like this. The Battle of Lachish was also like this, and we have some large stones over in the British Museum right now that show some of these things. And so, you would say to yourself, I certainly say to myself, and I think we all would, boy, why didn't they learn a lesson, Why didn't the people of Judah learn a lesson from the horrible, horrible things that happened to the people of the northern kingdom, the people of Israel? And you can't help but wonder, it seemed like that would have stuck in their minds, because Samaria was how many miles from Jerusalem? About 35 miles away. That's not very far. I live over in Camarillo, and that's just 44 miles away from here. And so 35, 40 miles is not very far. And that kingdom fell. Why didn't they learn something from it? Oh, we human beings are thick-headed as we can be sometimes. It's hard for us to learn sometimes from the tragedies of other people. Now, let's look at the other side of the thing for just a moment. Oh, there were some false prophets that were there too. The thing about the false prophets, when we hear that word, we think, well, they were mean, bad people. Not so much, not so much. They were prophets, not real prophets, they were false prophets, but they were prophets or preachers who preached things people like to hear. I mentioned some of this morning, but that's just exactly what they were doing. And they would preach things that people enjoyed hearing. And Jeremiah was just the opposite. Jeremiah was telling them, you're sinful, you're idolatrous, you're immoral, you're corrupt, you're going to suffer for all the things that you've done. False prophets come out. There's not a bit of truth in that at all. That's just Jeremiah trying to scare you. And he's a negative preacher. And he talks about sin and bad things and tells you how bad you are. I want to tell you how good you are. And this was the thing that they did. Well, surely enough, Jeremiah had warned them that the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar are going to come over and they're going to take some of you people captive. And there were 3 waves of this in the history of Judah. And surely enough, Nebuchadnezzar came over and captured some of these people because Israel or Judah was not doing what Nebuchadnezzar had required of them. So he came over, he took some of them captive. Well, let me read you something about a fellow named Hananiah, who was one of these false prophets. Here's something that he said. He prophesied in the name of the Lord. And here's what Hananiah said in the 28th chapter. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. That's a good introduction, isn't it? But he's a false prophet. He's speaking in the name of the Lord, but he's a false prophet. Here's what the Lord says. I will break the yoke of the king of Babylon. Within 2 years, I will be back in this place with all the articles of the Lord's house. You see, Nebuchadnezzar had come in and he'd taken a lot of the gold and the golden vessels and things like this out of the temple and carried them to Babylon. Oh no, in 2 years he'll put all of this back, and I will also bring back to this palace Jehoiakim, the son of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah. Well, they took the guy who was the king at that time. His name was Jehoiachin. His father's name was Jehoiakim, and they had taken him captive too. Oh, he's coming back. He's coming back. And all the other exiles from Judah who went to Babylon, declares the Lord, for I will break the yoke of the king of Babylon. Oh, wow. Doesn't that sound good? Yeah, there's hope. He's teaching us this don't going to last but just 2 years. What was Jeremiah saying? Jeremiah was saying it's going to be 70 years long. 70 years. It's going to be a terrible thing. False prophet comes along and says, nah, just 2 years. I'll all be back. Everything. After all, you're the children of God. You're God's chosen nation. God not going to let anything bad happen to you. You know, sometimes we get the idea that because we are Christians, that is an absolute assurance that God is always going to bless us, be good to us, and take us to heaven when we die. They don't stop and think about the importance of fidelity. Fidelity. Paul warned the Galatians of this over and over and over. He warned the Corinthians of this. He warned the Colossians of this. And yet, nothing happened. What was the trouble? Well, over in the 25th chapter, the chapter that we're reading for tonight, here's something he says, verses 3 through 7. For 23 years, that's a long time, by the way. For 23 years, from the 13th year of Josiah, the son of Ammon, the king of Judah, until this very day, the word of the Lord has come to me, and I have spoken to you again and again. What's the next statement? But you have not listened. You have not listened. And though the Lord has sent all of his servants, the prophets, to you again and again, you have not paid any attention. They said, turn now, each of you, from your evil ways and from your evil practices, and you can stay in this land that the Lord gave to your fathers forever and ever. Do not follow other gods to serve and worship them. Do not provoke me to anger with your hands, with what your hands have made, the idols and so forth. Then I will not harm you. What's the next statement? But they wouldn't listen. But you did not listen to me, declares the Lord. And you have provoked me with what your hands have made, and you have brought harm to yourselves. Well, that's a pretty sad situation, isn't it? Here's a man who for 23 years has been talking to these people, encouraging them, helping them, warning them over and over and over, telling them about the sins of their lives, and they wouldn't listen. They wouldn't listen. Why in the world didn't they listen? Don't they remember what happened to the kingdom of Israel? Don't they know what happened during the siege of Samaria when so many people lost their lives? No, they wouldn't listen. Well, Jeremiah says over 4 times in these few verses, he says they wouldn't listen. They wouldn't listen. Well, it's a serious thing for us not to listen to the Word. It's kind of an easy thing for us just to set it aside and, like I said this morning, don't read the Bible. Don't read the Bible. Study the Bible. As I mentioned this morning, I could read a book on atomic science and not have any idea about atomic science. But if I study the book, I'll get some idea of what it's all about. Folks, the Bible is the most challenging book you can possibly get hold of. And once it grabs you, once you really get intently interested in studying this thing, it becomes a challenge that you just can't hardly wait to pick it up again and read it and study it and find out. Read commentaries, read Bible dictionaries, read other literature, read what other people have said about this, and see if you can solve the problems that come up. When I was doing graduate work at Abilene, Frank Pack was my major professor, and I loved that man. He taught me so much. And one of the things at a seminar that he taught on the book of Acts, he said, you have to find the clash. And I thought at first, wait a minute, that doesn't even sound biblical. But yes, it is. Because the Bible is filled with problems. And once you get involved in one of these problems and you begin seeing what the solution is, your perspective changes so much. And it literally, I don't know of a better word, it's so much fun when we really become serious about studying the Bible. Well, look at Jeremiah's message versus the message of the false prophets. Jeremiah has a grim warning. You better straighten up and fly right. You better straighten your lives up. You better get rid of the corruption. You better take care of the poor and the needy. You better put your idols away. You better devote yourself to the Lord and all this sort of thing. And then the Lord will spare you. And the false prophets come along and they say, Jeremiah's just trying to scare you. That's all. He's just trying to scare you. All this stuff about your sins and so forth. You're good people. You're good people. let me tell you something about the joy of life and how you can be optimistic and so forth. Well, there's a difference between what Jeremiah did and what Jeremiah taught and what these people heard from their false prophets. Jeremiah was persistent in his proclamation. While I was preparing this lesson, I just couldn't help but sit down and think to myself, number one, he said, I've been doing this for 23 years to this very small nation. He was not, he wasn't a paid preacher or anything like that, but he was a prophet of God. He'd been doing this for 23 years. Don't you think he must have gotten discouraged? Nobody, well, I won't say nobody, almost nobody liked him. Get away from us, Jeremiah. We don't want to listen to you. And Jeremiah keeps coming back. Jeremiah keeps preaching. He keeps teaching. He keeps reminding them of their shortcomings, of their sins. And the false prophets come along and they say, don't pay attention to him. But Jeremiah is persistent. Jeremiah is going to get God's message off to these people. Well, I like to hear what I like to hear, and that was what the false prophets were doing. The Bible talks about those who tickle your ears. Tickle your ears, It's a symbolic expression, just says, oh, I love to hear that, I just love to hear that. Well, Paul told Timothy this. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. He says, in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who will judge the living and the dead, and in view of the appearing and his kingdom, I give you this charge. Preach the word. Be prepared in season and out of season. Correct, rebuke, encourage, with great patience and careful instruction. For the time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine. Oh, wow. The time will come when people won't put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. That's just exactly what Jeremiah was doing. He was preaching the word. And people were saying, we don't want to hear you. We want something that will satisfy. What do you do when you itch somewhere? You scratch. Makes you feel better. And so the symbolic idea, the figurative idea that Paul has here is my ears are itching, and boy, the things that those false prophets are saying, it scratches my ears. It makes me feel so much better. And so he says they will turn their ears away from the truth and turn to myths. That's so remote from me. It's so remote from you. It's so remote from all of us. I don't go for mythology. Well, that doesn't happen to be the thing that has been attractive in our culture. But how many things are there that are attractive that tend to draw us away? Well, the mythologies of ancient people, those things were very attractive to those people. And so when Paul writes to Timothy, he's writing against a pagan background. And these pagan mythologies were very attractive to these people. And so he says they turn aside from the truth and they follow these myths. Well, I had a preacher friend one time. Well, still a friend. He's moved away. But he was a very good friend, a very close friend of mine. He had been preaching for a congregation that was thriving. The congregation was doing well. He got fired. He got fired. He had been there 20-some years at that congregation. And the congregation was doing well. This happened on Tuesday night. Wednesday morning, this man called me. He said, Jack, come down to the office. I need to talk with you. I went down there, and then he spilled this whole thing to me. Discouraged. He was very discouraged. Very discouraged. Did Jeremiah ever get discouraged? Oh boy, yeah, he really did. He got very discouraged because it just seemed like that, he was criticized, he was arrested, he was put into a cistern, thrown in there, he was put in prison. Finally, he was kidnapped and carried to a foreign country in Egypt. All kind of bad things like that happened to him, but he never stopped. He never quit. His message was not a message to make people feel good. His message was make people aware of God. Aware of God's message. Well, you want everybody to feel good about you, don't you? I like for people to like me. Now, there's a minimum number of those people around, but I like for people to like me, and you do too. You like for people to like you. All of us want people to like us. Jesus made a statement that I think is real important here. He said, "Woe unto you when all men speak well of you, for that is how their fathers treated the false prophets." Isn't that an interesting thing? Beware when everybody speaks well of you. Well, why is that true? I go back to Noah. People didn't like old Noah. Noah preached for 120 years, and he didn't convert anybody. People didn't like Jesus. Jesus preached and taught and worked miracles and all of this sort of thing for 3 solid years, and he made more enemies than he did friends. Isn't that sad? But that's just the way it is. So Jesus says, watch out when everybody thinks you're a great man, you're a great guy, you're a great preacher or something like this. Beware of that. That might mean that you're not preaching the strength of the Bible. Now, that doesn't mean we have to be abusive toward people in our presentation. It doesn't mean we have to condemn everybody every time we turn around, our friends and so forth. No, that isn't what it means. It means instead, be like Jeremiah. Be persistent like Jeremiah was. Be consistent in the kind of life that you live so that people see you teach and preach, Jeremiah, this kind of life, and they see you live this kind of life. One of the sad parts of our culture today is that people speak and preach and teach and don't actually do. And so over and over and over, your televangelists, how many of them have had all kinds of terrible things that are going on in their lives? You see, when I become very, very popular, I guess, I've never have experienced that, but when I become very, very popular, I begin blending into the people. I don't want to upset this thing because everybody thinks I'm such a nice guy. And so I don't want to upset things. And so I tend to begin agreeing and agree and agree. Why do I agree? Because I don't want to offend these people because they think I'm such a good guy. And so that's the idea here. Jeremiah basically says, I don't care what you think about me. Jeremiah says, I'm going to present the word of the Lord just exactly the way it is. I'm not going to tell you what a good guy you are. I'm not going to tell you how you can succeed in business. I'm not going to tell you a lot of things about self-esteem and all this sort of thing that we spoke of this morning. I'm going to tell you instead the word of the Lord. And so Jeremiah was persistent in this, and he warned the people. The armies of Babylon are going to come over here, and they're going to destroy your great nation. Well, that took place. Now let's shift gears here for just a second. There's a group of very highly critical, quote, Bible scholars, and they are very popular. They're very well known, many of them. And they do not believe in the historical accuracy of the Bible. Let me give you an example. I went to school at Claremont, and it's one of the most liberal seminaries out there in the entire country. And I had a very famous, a world famous man to teach the book of Galatians. Opening day. He basically said, I don't remember exactly the words. I wish I could remember his exact words, but this was the theme of the thing. Now, if you're coming into this class and you think that Acts is history of Paul because we're studying Galatians and Paul and so forth, if you think that that's accurate history, then you probably are not going to get very much out of this class. And as it went on, I found out, well, for example, he says, the supposed missionary journeys of Paul. He talked about the book of Galatians tells us more about Paul than the book of Acts does, because the book of Acts is a fabrication. And he had this whole theory that was very, very popular, by the way, developed by a man by the name of F.C. Bauer. And the whole thing was, it isn't history at all. Instead, it has two sections, and the writer, whoever he was, wrote up in the 2nd century, according to this fellow and F.C. Bauer, the writer really was saying that there are two conflicting ideas in the book of Acts, and the purpose of Acts is to try and bring these contradictory, conflicting ideas together. One is kind of headed by James, and the other is kind of headed by Paul. And I probably ought not to say this, but it was almost comical to listen to him talk. But he's a world-famous exegete. And I've got a whole stack of notes from him, Well, here's the thing. People have thrown off on Old Testament history over and over and over. And so let me read you something that came from a man named Albright, W.F. Albright. W.F. Albright taught at Johns Hopkins University and was one of the greatest biblical archaeologists in the 20th century. He was the director of the Oriental Schools of the American Schools of Oriental Research for a number of years, and he really believed in the historicity of the Old Testament. And he had a lot of flack. Well, here's something that took place. You see, when Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed Jerusalem, the idea of the Old Testament is not only did he destroy Jerusalem, but he went into southern part of Judah and destroyed many of those cities as well. And the critics had said, nah, never took place. Never took place. Yes, he did. He went in and destroyed Jerusalem, but that's all it was. Well, archaeological investigation found out something. W.F. Albright refutes the claim of what he calls the radical critics of biblical history by referring to the work of a number of archaeologists who describe the vast devastation of many of the towns of Judah. Concerning the excavation in Judah, Albright says this: the results are uniform and conclusive. Many towns were destroyed by the beginning of the 6th century BC. Hey, that's exactly the time that Nebuchadnezzar began his exploits here and destroyed Jerusalem in 587, 6th century. Never again were they occupied. Others were destroyed at that time, and they were partly reoccupied at some later date. Still others were destroyed, and they were reoccupied after a long period of abandonment, marked by a sharp change in the stratum and by the intervening indications of the use of their use for non-urban purposes. There is not a single known case of a town in Judah proper which was continuously occupied through the exilic period. Well, why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this to say that so much of the historicity of the Old Testament is called in question. And so do we know whether Jeremiah really lived or not? Do we know whether Jeremiah really wrote or not? Do we know whether Jeremiah really made these statements and so forth? Yes, we do. The Bible is an accurate book. It is a book that gives us history, just as God, just as it happened. Well, there are a lot of people that Jeremiah experienced, a lot of people who really didn't think that evil was quite so bad. People will say, this is good when really it's evil. This is evil when really it's good. And so the prophets talk about that just a little bit. And so we're living in a situation today where we're not supposed to say anything bad about any other religion because it might be offensive. And so sometimes that which is really bad is treated as if it's perfectly all right. There are morals of our own day, very much the same way. People living together without being married. But the Bible teaches that there is sin in sexual activity like this without the bond of marriage. Oh, don't say anything bad about that. That's the way they want to live. And so a lot of times evil is spoken of as good. And Jeremiah attacks this problem quite frequently. Well, what was Jeremiah's big problem? Jeremiah's big problem was very simple. People would not listen to him. That was his big problem. He could not get them to listen. If some very, very, very famous preacher came in and was going to make a speech in some big auditorium, all the people who have ever heard of this preacher would come together, and they would praise him and so forth, all this sort of thing. Well, people would listen. But now you take somebody like Jeremiah. He's not very popular. Yes, he's pretty well known, but nobody likes him. Okay? And so Jeremiah says, my problem is, Israel, Judah, you won't listen to me. What's the problem today? Same problem. Same problem. Getting people to listen. Unfortunately, people who call themselves Christians many times also fall into the same category. Now, that sounds very negative, and some of these things that I've mentioned sound very negative. Read the book of Jeremiah, and you will find that he continues to talk in what people would think of as a negative vein. I'm saying this. We need to learn to listen to the Word even when we don't like the Word. There are things in the Bible I don't like. There are things in the Bible you don't like. There are prohibitions that I wish were not there. There are obligations that I wish were not there. But my responsibility is not to try and decide what I will and what I won't accept. My obligation, my responsibility is to try to do what a loving, wonderful God has laid out for me. He knows best. I had 4 children. And every one of them wanted to do something at one time or another, many times. They wanted to do something that I didn't want them to do. Why? Well, you're going to hurt yourself if you do that. You're going to harm you. You can even kill yourself. I don't care. I want to do this anyway. No, I knew what was best, and in some cases, I knew what was best for them. I knew some things that they needed to avoid. That's the way God is with us, folks. He knows what's best for us. And the prohibitions that he places on us are for our good. They're not arbitrary. They're for our good. The obligations that he places on us, they're for our good. And what I need to do is to learn to yield myself to his will. And in the long run, my children look back and they said, yeah, Mom and Dad were right, weren't they? And you said that same thing to your parents. In the long run, when we look back and we see what God has prohibited and what God has demanded. After a while, we realize the wisdom of this. We realize the compassion and the love that God put into this when he gave us these things. This exemplifies then our own responsibilities to stand for truth. It exemplifies this in spite of the fact we might not be very popular. Now, in this whole thing, God has given us an invitation. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke on you. For I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest to your soul. My yoke is easy, my burden is light." Doesn't seem that way sometimes, but in fact, that's the way it is. We're going to sing an invitation song now. If you're subject to the invitation of Christ, we invite you to come.